Would you like to know how abuse, neglect, and trauma affect your human development and human development in general? Now, most people do not want to talk about abuse, neglect, and trauma for obvious reasons. It's not exactly enjoyable conversation, but I guarantee you, if you watch this video, you will learn something about yourself and maybe others that you know that really, really matters, and it cuts to something really core and really deep. So despite it not being exactly a fun conversation, it is very interesting, and I hope if you watch the video, you will agree. Hi, my name is Jesse. Welcome to my channel, Open Source Owners, where we talk about what if humans had an owner's manual. And trauma would definitely be in that owner's manual because trauma affects people, first of all, differently, but also it can affect development and future adult maturity and wisdom and the potential for any individual human to really achieve what they want to achieve in life. So trauma is a disconnection from yourself, not just back then when it happened, but that has left an imprint or sort of an echo or sort of like a shadow version of ourselves in us now, and it affects our quality of life now. One thing to say about trauma, and there's we could write books about it. There are books about it. We could talk about trauma for hours and hours. But one just quick thing to say about trauma is individuals could experience the same event. One individual could come away from that event that happened and not have PTSD or any form of trauma. And another individual witnessing and experiencing the same event could walk away from that scenario having PTSD or having a traumatic reaction. So it's not the event per se, it's sort of the ecosystem or the ecology of the individual, the vulnerabilities, the history that they've had makes one vulnerable to potentially traumatic experience, let's say lodging itself into one's body and then being stuck and sort of leaving its imprint on us. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. One way to just understand that is many soldiers might go to war, even in the same troop, and some have come back with PTSD and others have not. How do we make sense of that? Well, that's what this video is about. A lot of it has to do with early childhood sort of vulnerabilities and early childhood development, as we shall see. Okay, so abuse and neglect, we know this for sure, that they raise inflammation within the body, and this can lead to systemic disease for all four of the big killers of Western civilization, which we've talked about in other videos. But I just like to keep these things fresh because statistically, these are the things that you and I, most people in the Western world, are most likely to get sick of eventually and die from eventually. Not to be morbid or anything, but these things are all influenced by chronic inflammation. So if we can lower and manage our inflammation levels, the likelihood of dying from any of these four things goes down. Heart disease, 23% of people will get heart disease, diabetes, 25% Alzheimer's, 10% and cancer, 20%. And actually some of the cancer figures are going beyond that now, where 1 in 2 males will get cancer in their lifetime. I'm not saying that all these four killers connect directly to abuse and neglect. They don't, but often they will. So if it does for you, then it's very important that you know that you have had experienced abuse and neglect or trauma, and then how to manage that and unpack that so that the abuse, neglect, and trauma no longer negatively affect your physiology or your psychology. Okay, so another thing to say about abuse and neglect, just to be clear, emotional neglect, aka a child not being heard, a child screaming and nobody coming, a child having to sort of fend for themselves, is a form of trauma. So we often think of that as less traumatic for individuals than like physical or sexual abuse. But actually what we know from the science is that emotional neglect is equally as traumatic, or can be, depending on all the risk factors, etc., as physical or sexual abuse. So don't think of one as more or less good or bad. It really depends on how often it happened, the type of vulnerabilities that you were exposed to as a children, as we shall see, and how you perceived that neglect or abuse as a child. That really is what matters and makes something traumatic or not. Okay, so what we're going to talk about here toward the end of the video is we're going to actually take a couple questionnaires, or I'm going to direct you to a place where you can take these questionnaires. The first questionnaire is called the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or the ACE questionnaire. And I'll talk more about that in a second, but I just want to give you some numbers on this. If you score 4 out of 10, so there's 10 questions, if you have 4 yeses, then you are 2 times as likely to be a smoker. You are 7 times as likely to be an alcoholic. You have an increased risk of emphysema and chronic bronchitis by nearly 400%. You have attempted suicide of 1,200%. And an ACE score of 6 of 10 or higher is at risk of their lifespan being shortened by 20 years. So the all-cause mortality is massive. So this is just by way of correlation, right? So when you take the ACE questionnaire, it is not a guarantee that if you get 4 yeses out of 10 that all these things will happen to you. It's just that you're more likely statistically. You could be an anomaly. You could not be part of this. You could have had 4 yeses on the ACE questionnaire and them not majorly affected your life, or you could have had 2 yeses on the ACE questionnaire and they could have totally majorly affected the quality of your life, and they could lead to statistics similar to this. But nonetheless, it is really important what happened to us as children, and they define that as below 18 or 18 and below. And we'll take that questionnaire in a second, so don't go anywhere right now. So what these high yeses on the ACE questionnaire or profound yeses on the ACE questionnaire, because you could have had 1 yes on the ACE questionnaire, but if it was profound and life-changing, that could lead to chronic stress, and that could lead to individuals, and we see this all the time in the hospital, with individuals having chronic fight and flight. So they're always in a fight or flight mode, and even when they're sleeping, it's like they feel like they're always just like revved up, ready to like defend against some like oncoming hordes or something like that. Living in the fight and flight zone is a form of chronic stress, and it taxes all of your other body systems, including your brain and your decision making, your creativity, but all the way down through the whole system, from heart disease to cancer to diabetes. All of that is negatively affected by living in chronic flight and fight, right? But the opposite is also true. Living in or going into regularly chronic freeze and dissociate is also chronically stressful. It's basically the body perceiving a life threat sort of at all times. And that's not a high quality of life if we're in those situations. And that'll lead to all the negative effects like we see here. Okay, so this type of thing leads to baseline high levels of stress, obviously, lowers the ability of the individual to enter play and exercise and rest and digest. Now, those 2 broad categories are where humans are meant to live. You know, we're meant to have, 80 to 90% of our lives living in play and exercise or rest and digest. Those 2 modes are highly beneficial for like things like wound healing. They're highly beneficial for community interactions, for problem solving, for creativity, all that type of thing. So we don't want to lower those. And of course, this will raise cortisol sort of semi-permanently, and this can cause all sorts of things, just having like cortisol constantly being triggered, and adrenaline would be in that same category. And you can read those there. But these are things that we want to avoid, right? So this is why we're talking about this in the owner's manual here. Things like trauma, abuse, and neglect really affect health, not just mental health, but physical health, all the way through one's life until, and probably only if, we address that trauma, abuse, and neglect. And that's work. It's not fun, but it is, it's sort of what we're here to do, in my opinion. Like, that's part of your journey. That's part of my journey, is to deal with these, the difficulties, the things that shaped us maybe poorly, the things that disconnected us from ourselves. And that's all part of our work, and that's what this channel is really trying to help with. And we'll get more into practical things in other videos. This is just sort of laying out the landscape a little bit. The other thing that these high ACE questionnaires can do is they can set up what are called insecure attachment styles. And we're going to talk about attachment styles in another video or a series of videos because it's so important. But just know that there's 4 types of attachment. One is called secure, and the other 3 are insecure. Now, they have specific names. I'll leave that for now. We'll talk about that later. But 50% of Americans live with a secure attachment. The other 50% live with one of the 3 forms of insecure attachment. Obviously, you don't want insecure attachment, just in case you're curious. You want secure attachment, if at all possible. Okay, so let's get into the 3 questionnaires now so that you can actually get a sense of where you are at in your life, what your development was like. And of course, you may have an idea of this. You may know it really well already. But for many people, having done this for now a decade, many people are sort of surprised, and it gives them a different view of what they themselves experienced as a child after completing these questionnaires. The first one is going to be the childhood experiences, or ACE questionnaire. Now, you can look up where this this ACE questionnaire was developed out of, but I do know that it was first given in Kaiser Permanente. That medical system began using this, and they got some very interesting data, and they had a huge data set, something like 18,000 or 20,000 people took this questionnaire, and then they pulled out a bunch of data from this, and then they subsequently had a bunch of different scientific studies that sort of suggested that the high ACE questionnaire scores, so 4 or more out of 10, really correlate with all sorts of things later on in life, and really, really correlate with mental health and what you might call mental diseases really well. So again, this is not a causative and this is not a diagnostic questionnaire, but this is a self-awareness and a self-knowledge questionnaire. Now, the next one is called Childhood Emotional Neglect, the CEN questionnaire. This comes from Dr. Joyce Webb, and she has written a book called Running on Empty. So if you score high on this one, I would highly suggest you get her book Running on Empty, so you understand like what to do about it and the ramifications of it, and you get to know this a little bit better. But this is for years I used to teach and give my clients the ACE questionnaire and the resiliency questionnaire, which is the next one. But I would leave out, because I didn't know about the childhood emotional neglect questionnaire. But as soon as I became aware of it, the CEN questionnaire, that started to open up a new vista, and it caught people who would otherwise score low on the ACE questionnaires and score decently on the resiliency questionnaire, and they'd be like, I don't know. I don't know why I have such struggles. I don't know why my relationships struggle. I don't know why I hate myself so deeply, these types of things. But then when I started to put in the CEN questionnaire, that was a big aha moment for a lot of people, because childhood and emotional neglect is trauma. It is traumatic to children, and it shapes their worldview quite profoundly. And if we sort of ignore it and focus only on physical or sexual abuse or verbal abuse, we're forgetting and we're ignoring this subtler version of trauma that is still just as profound and still life-changing for people. And then the last questionnaire is the resilience questionnaire, which was created, I believe, in response to the ACE questionnaire some years later as like hey, there's also this aspect that people have natural resiliency, and that actually matters a lot. That means you might score 4 yeses on the ACE questionnaire, but they might not have such a profound effect. Versus if you have very low score on the resilience questionnaire, aka you're quite fragile by nature or by epigenetic or whatever it may be, then those ACE questionnaires and CEN questionnaires will have a different effect on you. Okay, so these 3 questionnaires will really help you understand yourself a little bit in a more rich way, and I've put them together on my website. You can go to this tiny URL to find it. All three of those questionnaires are just there, and you can take them on the website. All right, that was it. So what I really want to do, aside from I want to invite you to download the 60-page ebook. If you haven't yet, it's got a ton of information about the ACE questionnaires, and different types of questionnaires. It's got a lot of the psychological background. It's got stuff on attachment, etc. So please do that. That's free. Click the link below, the Owner's Manual Part 2 there. And that was the video, how abuse, neglect, and trauma really affect our development. You cannot overstate the profundity that these 3 things have on human development, and therefore you cannot leave these out of the personal and spiritual development that we're trying to do. We have to address eventually, and hopefully sooner than later, abuse, neglect, and trauma in order to live a high quality life. So when you take those questionnaires, what I'd like you to do is just do that now. Like, there's no time like the present. Go ahead and jump on over to that tiny URL. In fact, I'll bring it back up for you. Why don't you jump over to that tiny URL right now, take those questionnaires, and then leave in the comments. You don't have to leave your scores if that's too personal, but leave like any aha moments. Like, what did you learn? What was sort of surprising? Had you done these before? Were these new to you? Did you have any big takeaways from this? I would love to hear. So just drop those in the comments below, and that way everybody who's watching this video gets to sort of like benefit from each other. I will also be reading those comments. I love that. Thank you guys so much for taking your time to watch this whole video. I appreciate it. If you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe, go ahead and like, hit the bell, do those YouTube things. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it really changes the algorithms. It really makes engagements in videos like this sort of like reach out. So then YouTube will start to go, oh, hey, they're getting a lot of engagement. We'll send this to people who might find it interesting. And that helps grow the channel, which is obviously important for me. But more important probably than that is it helps grow this information then begins to get out there more and more and more and more. We want to touch everybody on earth with this type of information so that we can actually change the world to a better place, right? That's the goal anyway. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for watching. I appreciate you. We'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.